Well, good morning. Welcome to the Verse by Verse podcast. Hope you had a great weekend and a good start to your week yesterday. Join with us today as we're back into the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to pick up in chapter 2, verse 18, and continue to look at who Mark says Jesus is and what he ought to mean to us. So, Noah, good morning.
Good morning.
So let's jump into Mark chapter 2, verse 18.
All right. And John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. And they came and said to him, Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, Can the attendants of the bridegroom fast when the bridegroom is with them? So long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. But the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise that patch pulls away from it, and a new from the old, and a worse tear results. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost, and the skins as well. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins. And it happened that he was passing through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to make their way along while picking the heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And he said to them, Have you never read what David did when he was in need, and he and his companions became hungry? How he entered the house of God around the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests. And he also gave it to those who were with him. And Jesus was saying to them, The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Consequently, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And he entered again into a synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they were watching him to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, Get up and come forward. And he said to them, Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill? But they kept silent. And after looking around at them with anger, grieved at the hardness of their heart, he said to the man, Stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And the Pharisees went out and immediately began taking counsel together with the Herodians against him as to how they might destroy him.
Well, as we kind of began in the Gospel of Mark, I've kind of presented the case that Mark presents Jesus as this king. Mm-hmm. And we looked in chapter 1 of all these different instances where the king expressed his authority and people bowed their knee or figuratively bowed their knee. Yeah. I mean, he showed his authority over sickness, over disease. He showed his authority in his teaching. Even the demons obeyed him. And then when he would call people, he didn't call them to follow God, but to follow me. And they left everything to follow him. Beginning in verse 18, though, down through, we have 3 different episodes where people resist the authority of the king. Okay. The first one, we begin in verse 18 when they look at the Pharisees approach Jesus and says, Why aren't you fasting? Why aren't you and your disciples depriving yourself, if you will, of your daily food? The fact is, fasting was always a controversial issue among the Jews. Really, God only commanded one day of one fast, and that is the Day of Atonement. By this time, the Pharisees seem to be fasting twice a week, and he's trying to raise Jesus and his disciples to their standards. We kind of read that in Luke chapter 18, verse 12. But Jesus here in his response to them says, in effect, we're here to do something different. We're not going to do things the way you do things. And he gives 3 illustrations. The first is about a bridegroom and a groom, and you're not going to be sad on the day of the wedding kind of thing. But he just says the fact that I'm here is something festive, something exciting, something joyful. You might think even of Jesus' first miracle in John chapter 2. It took place at a wedding feast. Yeah. It's a time of great joy and celebration. It's not a time to fast. And then he goes on and gives these 2 kind of strange illustrations about putting a piece of unshrunk cloth on an older garment. And the analogy is they will shrink at different rates and thus tear, or putting new wine in an old wineskin, and as it begins to ferment, the wineskin will burst. And while we could dig into those, it's again, those are just references that these two things don't mix. The attitudes of the Pharisees, even the covenant of Moses is not really going to mix with the covenant that Jesus was read. He's a new king in a new type of kingdom, even though they resisted it. The second one is it occurs on the Sabbath in verse 23. And as they're going along, his disciples are plucking some heads of grain, and the Pharisees come and approach them and says, "What you're doing on the Sabbath is unlawful." The fact of the matter is, by this time in the Mishnah, there's 39 different actions that are constituted as work. So anything on the Sabbath to them would be constituted as work. And Jesus then raises up this example of David and the showbread and Abiathar, the high priest. I want us to stop here for just a moment and notice how Jesus is arguing. He doesn't really answer their question.
Yeah.
He doesn't define what's work. He's not really elevating the example of David because he describes David as doing something that is unlawful. But really, he brings up this example to kind of correlate. Who was David? Well, he was the anointed king, but was not yet enthroned. And here Jesus, I think, is drawing a parallel example. Because at the very end, he says in verse 28, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So David, just like Jesus, is a king, but he's yet not on his throne. So they resisted his authority. And I guess the final one I'd throw is the last rebellion, as again on the Sabbath, in a synagogue, on the Sabbath, where he is to heal a man, and people are resistant of that. And what Jesus seems to point out to there, just to kind of again express his authority, is just point out to them they forgot the whole purpose of the Sabbath in the first place.
Yeah.
That the Sabbath was to remind them of liberation and freedom and healing. Look back in just Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 12 through 15. It says, "Keep the Sabbath day to treat it as holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. For 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work that day, you or your son or your daughter or your male slave or your female slave, or your ox or donkey or any of your cattle or your resident who stays with you, so that your male slave and your female slave may rest as well as you. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out there by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to celebrate the Sabbath day." They seem to forget even the purpose of liberation and freedom and God's hand being stretched out. So much so, by the end of this episode in verse 6, they're not only submitting and resisting his authority, they're now conspiring to kill the king. They want a coup and to cast down the rightful ruler of this world. So again, an image of a king. And the challenge to us is, are we going to submit to him, or are we going to resist like these people? First of all, are we going to take offense because Jesus and his kingdom is not like what we would picture? Are we trying to mix Jesus and force him into a box like they did when he was fasting? Or are we going to kind of put a bunch of rules in place and say he can only do this or he can only do that he's not previously expressed? Or are we going to recognize him as the king, the one to tell us what to do? And third, just don't forget that our king came to bring healing and to bring liberation and freedom. He doesn't call us just to be slaves in his kingdom in the sense of we are slaves, but to be just menial workers, but he calls to give us a blessing. So I think that's, what do you see in the text?
No, I mean, nothing much to add. Verse 5 always just kind of, I don't know, makes my hair stand on end. Jesus gets angry so little within the gospel narrative, I feel like. You see him in, I think it's in Mark 6 and in John 6, the feeding of the 5,000. He looks around, he has compassion on these people. He sees them like sheep not having a shepherd. Even at his own trial and before Pilate and before Herod, not getting angry, not, talking anything. But there are certain points when he's dealing with these hard-hearted Pharisees, or obviously during the temple cleansing scenes. But I think there's really something special about the instances where Jesus gets angry, and I would imagine, I don't know that these are all necessarily back to back or what the chronology is here, but just having to experience the hardness of these hearts from these people over and over and over again, like you were saying, that would make me angry. And I guess what's really cool about it to me is watching how Jesus deals with his anger. We read over and over again, be angry and do not sin, and Jesus just does that so well, right? Becoming angry, a righteous anger at the way in which they are living apart from God, apart from his will. But then Jesus addresses it in such a holy and righteous way, focusing on healing and focusing on teaching rather than vengeance or seeking his own.
Yeah, that's a cool point. In verse 5, he looked around them with anger, but then he was grieved at their hardness of heart.
Yep.
One of the most famous verses in Scripture is when Jesus arrived in Bethany upon the death of his friend Lazarus, and it says he wept. As I've kind of studied that text, obviously he felt sorrow because his friend had to experience that, but he was really weeping over the hardness of hearts, it seems to me, that he was experiencing. So while he had anger, he also had grief, kind of tied together because of their reaction to this king.
And I guess the lesson for me is, I think just humans in general, were very emotional, and Jesus was human, and so he was emotional. But we get emotional when people hurt us, or we get emotional when things aren't going our way, and that's when our emotion starts to boil over. Jesus gets emotional when people are disobeying God. Jesus gets emotional when, like you were saying, he looks around and sees hardness of heart, and again, deals with it righteously. I need to learn a lesson from that as well, that I can't let my emotion control me. I control my emotion to where I get angry when God isn't being served or when God isn't being respected, and then I deal with that in a righteous way, like you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, we get emotional over the right things.
Yeah.
I mean, as you said, sometimes even our emotions become selfish in nature versus God-centric or focused on God.
Even in spiritual matters, they can become self-focused, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I hope that helps you, cause you to think a little bit more about Jesus as our King, challenges us to live more like him and accept his rule in our lives. Just a quick word before we kind of sign off for the day. The next 3 weeks, we will be taking a break. Noah is going to Kenya and the Seychelles to be preaching the gospel, share the kingship of Jesus to folks in those areas, and hopefully meet saints that are already there. And so we'll be taking a short break for 3 weeks, and then we'll jump back into the Gospel of Mark. Hope you all have a great week. God bless.